The Wendigo is a cannibalistic humanoid monster that figures in the legends of the Algonquian native peoples in northern Canada. In 2008, I was interviewed by a local newspaper to look at my investigations into the Wendigo phenomenon, both the legend and the historic cases that had occurred.
In July 2008, Edmonton resident Vince Lee boarded a Greyhound bus for Manitoba, leaving behind his wife and a job as a newspaper carrier. With a history of mental instability and repeated episodes of wandering, Lee's wife was accustomed to her husband's behavior. He stayed overnight in Erickson, Manitoba, where he slept on a park bench and sold some possessions to a local boy. Then he boarded another eastbound bus the next day, and outside of Portage-la-Prairie inexplicably attacked a fellow passenger, Tim McLean. Other passengers fled in panic and barricaded him inside the bus until police arrived. During a long standoff with RCMP, Lee was seen beheading his victim and cannibalizing parts of his body before finally giving himself up hours later. The story that followed made international news. Lee was found with parts of his victim's ear, nose, and portions of the mouth in a white bag in his pockets. Witnesses described him as 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, with a cool, calm demeanor during the entire event. During his initial court appearance a few days later, Lee was mostly silent, except for muttering the words, "Please kill me."
It was a small town just outside of Winnipeg. It was a public transportation in North America, in one of the safest countries in the world, and this event happened, and it's not an isolated incident. It doesn't happen too often, but it does happen.
I took it seriously enough, this Greyhound bus case, that I myself realized the similarities between what I had put in a newspaper article and what subsequently happened.
Yeah.
I took it seriously enough that I ended up phoning the police, the RCMP, in Portage-la-Prairie, where Vincent Lee was being held at the time, and did in fact tell them he had previously delivered a newspaper in which just about everything that played out on that bus had been mentioned.
As details emerged about Vince Lee in the following months, one thing stood out for Nathan Carlson. Vince Lee's last job before he left Edmonton was as a newspaper delivery man for both major Edmonton newspapers. One that was mentioned was the Trout Lake incident of 1896. In Trout Lake, in northern Alberta, a man who claimed to be possessed by a Wendigo made a request to his family. "Please kill me."
My name is Robert Brightman. I was a graduate student in linguistics and anthropology at the University of Chicago in the 1970s. and encountered reading materials pertaining to the subject in a course I took with one of my professors there on Native American people. A kind of being recognized by the in many Ojibwe and Cree-speaking communities of Canada, and now we're talking all the way from Quebec, Labrador on the east out to Alberta and even BC on the west now. A category of beings which existed in an earlier condition of the world, sometimes not always gigantic and cannibalistic or anthropophagous, monstrous in the sense that they ate human beings.
Wendigo is a legend that dates back to the earliest written records in Canada and was often portrayed as a monstrous cannibalistic creature that was unstoppable. It was often attributed to coincide with famines, and manifested itself as a condition where people believed they were possessed by this monster or cursed by someone wanting to do them harm. This condition occurred many times across the country in the sub-boreal regions from Quebec to Alberta and parts of BC. In recent times, most notably in Alberta, where it was so extensive that curfews and numerous Salem-style trials took place in remote communities. The last recorded case was in the 1960s.
Secondly, we're talking about a belief which begins to be attested in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, that as a result of a tragedy of one kind or another, a human being can become like one of these monstrous cannibal beings, transform into one, whereupon it loses a human identity, it eventually loses the power of speech. It begins to perceive human beings, including members of its own family, as game animals, a moose, a beaver, a ptarmigan, whatever it may be. And the idea would be that if such a being is allowed to proceed along this course, it will become increasingly powerful. Eventually, it will kill and devour the people with whom it's traveling or with whom it's camping.
There have been many representations of Wendigo in comics, books, television shows, and movies which focused on the supernatural monster aspect, similar to the Sasquatch legend, but there was a time when this was a serious problem, in the late 1800s.
There are some cases in the UK that describe creatures that are sort of similar to the archetypal image of the Wendigo, with their sort of large and human-sized, hairy. As far as I know, the Wendigo legend is very much a Canadian, native Canadian one, and the fact that there were a lot of Scottish fur traders around perhaps didn't really have a lot of. There's no obvious evidence of cultural transmission there, so far as I know. So I think that you have got a fairly unique case there. But what we can compare it to certainly are sort of other cases in which people were supposedly possessed.
Things were still happening here at the very time when the missionaries were here. So we have evidence of the whole process, how it played out.
One of the cases mentioned in the July 20th newspaper article was about a Cree trapper by the name of Swift Runner. Swift Runner was the first person in Canadian history to be executed by the Northwest Mounted Police, who later became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Swift Runner was convicted for murdering and cannibalizing his wife and 5 children. The 6th child had died of starvation. It was never confirmed, but it was believed he also may have murdered 2 others close by, totaling 8 victims. When he was arrested, he claimed that it was because he was possessed by a Wendigo.
This is the remains of the Fort Saskatchewan post. It was built for the Northwest Mounted Police when they first came into what was then the Northwest Territories, now in the province of Alberta. And they came to maintain law and order in dealing with the settlers and the native inhabitants. And basically, what had happened is that in 1878 and 79, one of the most bizarre crimes in Canadian history transpired.
When you sit down and look at all the cases, we only have evidence, to the best of my knowledge, for one in which an individual committed cannibalism. This is the Swift Runner case, which I have written about. Nathan Carlson has written about it. Many people have written about it. This is an individual who killed and ate the members of his family in a circumstance both in which there was game available to him in the area of the bush where he was trapped, and he was also within a day's travel of a Hudson's Bay Company outpost. So there's no explanation for this other than some kind of mental disorder.
He had claimed that all of his family had perished from starvation the previous winter. He himself was a very large man, well over 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds. He certainly did not appear to be starving. So he was arrested under the suspicion of murder. The police officers at the Fort Saskatchewan apprehended Swift Runner and brought him to where his camp was. And he would continually lead them off the track to where his camp was the winter of 1878. But finally he gave in, and what they had found was a series of bones, the remains of his family littered around. This evidence, when collected together, had established that Swift Runner had volitionally murdered his family, his wife and his children, and had consumed their bodies.
Swift Runner didn't commit these murders in the presence of anyone who survived them. As far as I know, I mean, although he showed some interesting symptoms, screaming fits and night terrors and so on. The connection to the Wendigo was actually made sort of subsequently. It wasn't particularly something that was raised, as far as I know, at the trial.
It turned out during the course of his trial, he was found to be guilty of murder of these numerous individuals and was sentenced to execution by hanging. Swift Runner was actually the first person executed in Canada under the jurisdiction of the Northwest Mounted Police.
The news about Swift Runner's horrific deed reached far and wide. In a similar fashion to the Vince Lee killing, the media focused on the more lurid details. American newspapers printed stories of a savage cannibal who laughed in the courtroom while describing eating his family, but this was far from the truth.
To develop something called the Wendigo psychosis and attribute it across the board to potentially to Algonquian people, again from BC on the west to Quebec Labrador on the east, on the basis of this one case, something a little bit out of proportion here.
So we have this one case that is verifiable. Yeah. A number of other cases that we can't substantiate. If we take them as truth, then we know for certain that Wendigo cannibalism was a reality. Yeah. This is the one case that we do have that establishes this as an undeniable fact. Yeah. So when you put those facts together, it suggests that there was Wendigo cannibalism. Yeah.
Basic elements of Wendigo. Well, it's the idea of a cannibal monster. It's the idea that a human being can turn into it. And then finally, the Wendigo or Wendigo psychosis. Wendigo is Ojibwe. Windigo would be Cree in most dialects. There could be some differences. Finally, the belief by anthropologists that some Algonquians underwent something called a Wendigo psychosis, where the belief system somehow caused them not only to fear becoming such a monster, but to actually develop cannibal urges and then to act on them, to kill people and eat them.
When you got people that are acting very, very strangely, and this, what appears to be like a psychosis, becomes contagious. You could say one thing and make an argument if you said, well, these two people are related, so maybe if there's schizophrenia, maybe there's a family history of schizophrenia. But when these people are unrelated, then it really makes you wonder, how is a mental illness get contagious? How are psychoses passed from one person to the next? So it really makes you wonder then what this really is. Is there one thing that this is, or are there many things? One of those particular cases happened to be the one that transpired and ended here at the Charles Camsell Hospital. The one place we know of where a Wendigo woman, or a woman who believed she was being possessed by the Wendigo spirit and had all of the associated symptoms with that, and was held here. So this is an actual piece of physical evidence of Wendigo. There's not a lot of these remaining or surviving pieces of physical evidence left in the world. There was an episode of time from the late 1800s until about 1940, 1950, where people were hospitalized. And prior to that, they were dealt with the police. And prior to that, it was done in the, I guess you'd say, the country fashion, where people were cured, and if that was unsuccessful, they were executed. So
I'm just wondering, like it seems prevalent in the boreal, subarctic boreal areas.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And then it stops when you get to the plains and when you get down into the part of the Great Lakes where you start having regular farming.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just because it happened there much later than it happened in all these other places, so it was closely, carefully documented. Yeah. And in Quebec, this happening in the 1600s, so the veracity, the truth of the accounts back then, we can't really... Whereas here, we have this stuff happening in the 1940s.
So we have a couple of cases of this in the subarctic area where Cree and Ojibwe people lived. So there was a doctrine or a belief present in some areas during some periods that someone who had committed, let's call it famine cannibalism of this kind, thereafter, as a result of having taken human flesh into his or her body, that would catalyze a transformation of that individual into a Windigo or a Wendigo monster, who thereafter would seek human flesh, not out of necessity, but by, as it were, by preference. The other, I don't know how to put it, he's, somebody dreams of the wrong thing. You might dream of Misquami, some entity associated with ice. As a result of having that dream, and you might not even remember having had it, you are predestined to turn into a Windigo or a Wendigo later on in your life. Might be many, many years later, or it might be very, very soon. And this is how, as I understand it, and as how people have explained it to me, how it could happen that a human being could transform from being a human to being a Wendigo. Then it could be what we would call witchcraft or sorcery. Another individual could, this is how someone speaking Cree would put it in English, they'd say they could put that on you or put that in you by means of sorcery.
Wendigo was defined as a cultural-based syndrome during the 1980s and was largely discredited. This was partly based on the assumption that all eyewitness testimony was strictly Aboriginal and no non-native accounts could verify this as a legitimate phenomenon. Cultural-based syndrome is a term used for conditions that affect a specific social demographic, like anorexia, a syndrome common to our modern culture.
Sure. I'm Dr. Leah Menace. I'm a forensic psychologist with the University of Alberta. When we start talking about how mental disorders manifest in different cultures, it leads to this issue of culture-bound syndromes or culturally specific mental disorders. I don't know if there is a state of the science on that issue, whether these are specific, unique disorders that occur only among certain cultural populations and are unique to them, or whether they are manifestations of other disorders that are documented in other places but are somehow shaped by the cultural or social contingencies that the person is in. And certainly there seems to be some good evidence that that can happen. Anorexia nervosa, for example, is a disorder that is or has been relatively unique to North America and Western Europe. And we can speculate about why that is, an increased emphasis on physical beauty, superficiality, media messages, and the degree to which television and news media have sort of infiltrated people's lives in those cultures. So it would make sense that if there was going to be an underlying, say, anxiety disorder, that it might be shaped in that direction by the crucible of the culture that the person is in.
I would say that it probably wasn't very well thought out. It fit into an ongoing research program at the time, which was, you could sum it up, the study of the culture-bound psychiatric syndrome. The idea that societies with unique cultures have perhaps unique categories of mental illness, and it was assumed that Wendigo or Wheatigo fit into this.
And in the 1980s, there was pretty much a consensus that Wendigo was discredited. And that basis was founded on the assumption that the native people who were experiencing this phenomena could not objectively report it fully. And so what was needed was somebody from a non-native cultural background who wasn't within those cultural boundaries or those premises to objectively report what was going on. And the claim was made that no such records existed. So in the early 1980s, Wendigo was shelved away as just a peculiarity, and it was considered discredited.
Off the top of my head, my knee-jerk reaction is it would be difficult to exaggerate the strange ideas that white people can come up with about Indian people. And this may be one example of this, that there's something in the culture of Ojibwe and Cree people which has the power to cause people, whether or not they're suffering from something we'd consider to be a mental disorder, to develop not just a fear that they're going to turn into a cannibal monster, but actual cannibal desires, and then to act upon it. So I think it's not a pleasant thing to acknowledge, but I think there's an element of crypto, I don't know if I'd call it racism, but I suppose that's as good a term as any.
I mean, obviously there are lots of types of phenomena which are very unique to sort of certain place and time. I've never found anything which is at all similar to the Wendigo in the classic Canadian folklore anywhere else. So I think that's a good example of a story which has enough very unique elements to make it quite locale specific. And there are similar cases. I mean, for example, in Africa, there have been quite a few really peculiar panics in Western Africa involving people's belief that sorcerers can turn themselves into big cats, typically leopards, and then will prowl through the jungles, and if they encounter human beings, they'll leap on them, tear them to pieces, and kill them. But in a way typical of a leopard rather than a human being. So murders involving sort of extreme violence are sometimes explained by the existence of man-leopard societies, as they're called, which are sort of groups of sorcerers getting together to actually transform themselves into animals. Similar, I suppose, in a sense to the werewolf legend, only in this case it's a sort of deliberate transformation which sorcerers do for specifically evil purposes. And that it seems, I've encountered cases of this in Nigeria, in Liberia, and in Sierra Leone. So they're all West African, and they seem to be unique to that one area, but they're quite widespread within that area. And again, have been occurring until relatively recently. The most recent man-leopard panic in West Africa took place in Nigeria after the Second World War, in about 1948-49.
Another which is really interesting is Koro. I don't know if you've come across that. No. Koro, which is specific to China, Malaysia, Indonesia, and it's a disorder in which the underlying concern is anxiety, but the person with relative brief onset becomes hyper concerned that their genitalia are receding into their body, and it's particularly among men, but also to a lesser degree among women, where they believe that their genitals are shrinking, are being sucked into their body. They may engage in behaviors to prevent that from happening and end up mutilating themselves in the process. But the interesting thing about it is that it seems to occur in countries where fertility and patriarchal lineage is a very highly valued commodity. And so you could make the argument that there's an underlying sort of pool of anxiety there that might in another culture manifest in a different fashion, but in that particular culture, that is one of the values or concerns that is held dearly, and that's sort of the window through which it becomes manifest.
Scholarship later on in the 1980s came up, and certain documents came up that showed first-hand eyewitness testimonies from Euro-Canadian people who were saying the same things about Wendigo. And so when you looked at their reports in comparison with the Aboriginal people's reports, and you put these together, it's statistically astronomical for it to be a coincidence. So we can say now with, I would say with 100% certainty that this was something real.
The so-called Wendigo psychosis, I'd like to say right up front, I don't think that's the appropriate vocabulary word. I'm not sure psychology or psychiatry necessarily has an appropriate vocabulary item to refer to this yet, so I'm just going to leave that open. What it was is an understanding on the part of primarily anthropologists that as a result of this belief system, as a result of the belief that human beings under certain circumstances could turn into Wendigo cannibal monsters, the idea would be that individuals who are experiencing symptoms of what we would call mental illness, mental disorder, and this could be psychosis, schizophrenia, neurosis, what have you, might interpret these symptoms, whatever they might be, hallucinations, anxiety, whatever, they would interpret them in terms of stories or knowledge current in the community about human beings turning into Wendigo.
Auditory hallucinations are the most typical type of perceptual disturbance in schizophrenia and psychosis. So hearing people either, sometimes it's just commentary on what you're doing. It's like there's a narrator. Yeah. Oh, now he's walking to the coffee machine. Now he's pouring a cup. And maybe that narrative is judgmental. It's saying nasty things about you. Very often that's what the voices are doing, is they're criticizing, they're judging, they're belittling. They're very unpleasant for the individual. In other cases, they're giving them command hallucinations, telling them to do things, more typically to harm themselves than to harm others. And in most cases, they don't listen to those. It's not like they're not bothered by it, but they don't blindly obey the voices every time they speak. So it's common to hear voices and not uncommon for them to be command hallucinations, but they're typically not commanding violent behavior, and most of the time, people suffering from them don't abide by them.
In a way, a lot of the symptoms do mimic paranoid schizophrenia, but if someone was willing to and understood what Wendigo really is, they should be able to see the difference between Wendigo and paranoid schizophrenia. how they are not the same.
Well, I mean, that's not atypical in schizophrenia, is to have visual hallucinations, see things that other people don't see in the room, or hear things that other people don't see in the room. Yeah. And in severe enough depression, you'll hear people describing sort of visual hallucinations, but not as crystallized or specific as the ones I was just describing. It's more like seeing shadows moving out of the corner of their eye, or in the darkness they see figures moving. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's not out of the realm of sort of typical symptoms, but making it specific to animals, I mean, it could be, but it's not specifically that.
Cannibalism has become a topic of debate amongst scholars, historians, academics, as to whether it truly existed or not as a social norm in previous times. It was often used as a blood libel, written into text to depict certain cultures in a negative light by labeling them as cannibals. Blood libel dates as far back as the written word, but recent findings show early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals may have practiced volitional cannibalism.
Wendigo cannibalism was a historic reality. It was something that was committed in the Swiftrunner case, is the one case that we know of that confirms it. We wouldn't have any real evidence otherwise. It's not likely to get evidence of cases where cannibalism was committed, because just by their very nature they wouldn't have been able to have been reported by someone with a pen and paper. Because the people would have been in emergency crises. So any information that would have been recorded after the fact.
So we have this idea not only of this monstrous category of beings, but that human beings can turn into them. Okay, how? A number of different ways. The two most commonly discussed would be, there are occasional incidents in the records of what gets called informally lifeboat cannibalism. It's cases where individuals in a food crisis will use the body of one of their deceased companions as food in order to survive. Events like this are attested, I think, in all conditions of society. The story goes, and here I believe is the logical problem. The anthropologists and others who wrote about this, and we're talking in the 1950s and 60s primarily, into the 70s, suggested that such individuals then began to actually experience cannibal desires. And there are various, in my opinion, rather far-fetched, but these nonetheless exist. There are various depth psychology theories suggesting that all of we members of the species Homo sapiens have deeply rooted cannibal urges, which we repress. Fine, you know. The idea is that these would be somehow unleashed in these people by the belief system. As a result, some of these people not only feared becoming a cannibal monster, but they developed cannibal desires, cannibal urges, and in some cases acted upon them.
Ergotism, a condition related to a poisonous fungus found in rye, had impacts on European society similar to Wendigo. Victims often experienced convulsions, hallucinations, and a sensation of burning around the limbs which led to gangrene. The symptoms were often attributed to witchcraft or possession, and there were cases of executions of victims due to these beliefs. For ergotism, there was never any reports of cannibalism, but behavior attributed to people under the influence of drugs leading to cannibal tendencies makes it possible Wendigo was a physiological condition due to poisoning. In areas of the world where cultural practices involve hallucinogens like ayahuasca or peyote, there are increased reports of a condition called lycanthropy, a very rare psychological condition where a person believes they are turning into an animal. It's believed the myth of the werewolf may have been derived from cases of mental illness and symptoms of lycanthropy. One theory is that a person uses an animal state of mind to express their homicidal desires. The guilt drives them insane, and stress triggers a semi-permanent animal state of mind.
These are very rare cases. I can't honestly say I've seen one myself directly in practice, but in those cases I would expect they are not growing up in normal environments with normal behavior, and then all of a sudden at the age of 20 or 25 they are afflicted with this sudden penchant for sex that involves consuming people or violent behavior sort of thing. So they're probably coming out of environments where they have inconsistent parenting, quite possibly neglect and physical or sexual abuse. They may have been sexualized at a young age through abuse. But again, these are very, very rare cases, and so you really probably would have to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
Court psychologists dealing with Vince Lee later revealed that he was suffering from hallucinations where he believed his victim was a demon. As for Lee's cannibalism, the only explanation is that by eating his victim, he was preventing the demon from escaping. Other famous cases of cannibalistic killers, such as Jeffrey Dahmer, explain it as being closer to their victims. In a bizarre coincidence, one of the other patients in the same facility as Vince Lee, a man by the name of Dean Ride, was convicted for cannibalizing his wife in Winnipeg. In interviews, he also described it as being closer to her. In cases of psychosis triggered by hallucinogens, often the hallucinations sound similar both to Vince Lee's reasoning and to historical cases of Wendigo. On the 3rd anniversary of the Greyhound incident, another murder occurred in Manitoba where a woman was found beheaded. Could something so severe trigger a chain reaction of psychosis?
That's the thing about this. Whether or not he did have this condition from a semiotic perspective, or in terms of meaning, or in terms of a category, he certainly most would be a Wendigo.
But 100 years ago, they would have called him a witch if he was living in northeastern Massachusetts, if he was living in African culture. And we still see this even in Canada in psychiatric hospitals with African immigrants who have mental illnesses or psychotic breaks here. Very often the content of their delusional beliefs center around someone having put a spell on them, that they cannot be successful in life or in love because somebody has put a hex on them in some way, shape, or form, and that they have to behave in a fashion that will undo the hex, whether it's some symbolic behavior, whether it's aggressing against the person who they believe is responsible for it. So I think that's where context and culture comes into play, is that your circumstances both help to dictate what the content of your psychotic process is going to be. People in the U.S. who are paranoid schizophrenics, most of them are probably not worrying that CSIS, the Canadian intelligence agency, is spying on them. They think the CIA is, right? So they fill in the blanks of a delusional thought structure with that which they're familiar with.
The Hammersmith ghost, where for a period of 2 or 3 weeks, Hammersmith, which is actually where I live in West London, had been plagued with reports of a ghost clad in white scaring passers-by after dark. I mean, at that time, Hammersmith was just a village. There were no street lights, and it was very easy to be scared in that way. Somebody talked about this in the pub with a man who was an excise officer who happened to own a blunderbuss. So he went out patrolling, looking for the ghost, and when he saw a figure clad in white coming towards him, he challenged the ghost, or as he thought it was, and when he didn't get a response, he raised his gun and shot and hit the figure in the face. And it was actually just a bricklayer who, because of all the dust, bricklayers in those days used to wear sort of all white outfits, and he'd been going home from his work totally innocently and was shot dead. And again, a very similar thing happened. The guy immediately handed himself in to the police, confessed what had happened. He was tried, convicted of murder. I mean, the jury wanted to convict him of manslaughter, in fact. The judge directed that wasn't possible in this case. They had to convict of murder, but the prerogative of mercy would apply to the Crown. And literally the same evening, which is unbelievably quickly, actually, the King granted a pardon, and he ended up only spending 6 months in prison as a result of this. So again, the same legal principle is being applied here. If you sincerely believe that the thing that you're attacking is not a human being but a ghost, you can't be found guilty of sort of premeditated murder.
I think that sometimes we give too much weight to this copycat idea because you have a big event that becomes very public and is on the tip of everybody's tongues, and suddenly we're hypersensitive to that issue, and now it becomes much more acutely on our radar. And so these behaviors might have been happening on a relatively, they never happen on a regular basis, but they may have been happening at their low base rate anyway. But once one has happened that has brought it to notoriety, then we become much more aware of these things, and we zone in on them. And I think that factors in quite a lot, particularly with school and workplace violence, major domestic violence like murder-suicide type events. And we look at it as though it is a unique event, but in fact it is not. These things happen quite typically. This just happens to be a single incident that for whatever reason has grabbed the public's attention.
At a first glance, Wendigo has all the telltale signs of a mental illness, but the individual who determined it was a cultural bound syndrome during the 1980s came across a mysterious historical account known as the Trout Lake case, which could suggest otherwise. Among eyewitness accounts documented from northern Alberta were strange symptoms which suggest a legitimate physiological affliction beyond a mental disorder. We traveled north of Edmonton to investigate the area this bizarre event occurred.
The individual who wrote this material debunking Wendigo did find this last case, which was the Trout Lake case, and that one was very, very clear and explicit. And so it was when these very explicit cases were found by this particular anthropologist or historian, when these were brought forward in cohort with all of the other surviving native testimony that's recorded by such explorers as Sir John Franklin and Alexander Henry and David Thompson, you look at it, and these, when added together, it makes a very, very compelling case. That's all that remains of a person. Does anyone even know who that is?
When Nathan came across this case, as well as the report of the Wendigo prophecy and the resulting execution of a suspected Wendigo, he was shocked to find those involved were his own ancestors.
Oh, here she is. She was born the very same year the Trout Lake case happened.
Oh, really?
This is my great-grandmother. This whole thing really hit home for me. It was as if this was a story coming to life. This whole thing, this whole series of events, even leading into the present, it just seems like one big living story. It's as if the story itself is trying to tell itself, and it's a message. And the point hit home for me when I realized that the people that were involved in this story were my own relatives, my own ancestral relations. So it was almost as if somewhere, somehow, I was meant to hear this story and meant to look into it and to find it.
In 1895, a medicine man in Alberta foretold of the coming of the Wendigo, and the community at Trout Lake erected a totem to protect the village from its influence. A priest, convinced it was merely superstition and eager to convert locals to Christianity, immediately took down the totem to prove a point. Shortly after arrived a man named Napanin, who came to visit his father, but tragically succumbed to a frightening condition that drove him insane. Francis Beaton, a local Hudson's Bay employee, witnessed this event and wrote it down. The following are excerpts from his letter. Trout Lake, January 3rd, 1896. Man arrived here today from Wabasca Lake who seemed to me to be crazy. The man's name is Napanin, but he saw the devil come to him. He said his son appeared to him like a young moose and he wanted to eat him. The Indians are all terribly frightened, think someone had done something to him with medicine. Yaquimo is a great medicine man, and that is why they put him here. I expect they will try to drum the devil out of him. Sunday the 12th. I went to see him today. He looks worse than ever. I gave him a dose of castor oil. He says his heart is freezing. He's always saying that he is going to be a cannibal. I read a few prayers out of the prayer book. He seemed to be getting worse all the time. He does not look like a human being. He seems to be terribly swollen in the body and face. I do not know how this will end. The sight of him is enough to frighten any person. When I told them that we would tie him, they said it was no use, as no ropes could hold a cannibal. The sound of him was terrible. He was calling like a wild bull. We tied him with the ropes, and I left them to come and get more rope, but could not find any that was of use. Now Yaquimo was the only man they thought could kill him. But Yaquimo did not want to do it. He wanted me to do it. I told him that I would not do it. At last Yaquimo said, "You all want me to do this. I will try." He then took the axe. I went to the door. I seemed terribly frightened. I came back again. He had already struck him on the head once with an axe. Napanin was executed by beheading and buried under a pile of logs to prevent a resurrection. News spread fast to other communities and a panic set in, causing starvations from fear to enter the woods to hunt and trap.
From as far as I can tell, this is where Mr. and Mrs. Auger would have arrived, the direction that they would have arrived from, somewhere in here, coming up from Wabasca. So somewhere about 15-20 miles into that woods over in that direction, that's where Napanin, where Felix said he claimed to have seen the devil. It happened somewhere in there, and they would have headed in from that direction at their last camp. There was some kind of clearing in there, and came up through here, and then hence arrived and went over to where the post was originally back in 1896. It's really, it really does give a sense of the magnitude of this story and the journey that they took. And whatever happened, something strange happened in that forest over there, and that's you never know where it did happen, and I'd probably best keep it that way. I don't know if I'd ever go into that area where whatever it was he saw was, but that's where it is. That's where it was. So Worthy was the cabin where he was placed was back over in that direction, and they had after they'd killed him, brought him over somewhere in this locale and laid the log pile, and it was at least there till the 1940s. I know my own grandmother had seen it. So, of course, the original logs are gone, but this would be the site. Even a simple pile of logs out in the middle of the forest can have a very ominous and very significant meaning if you know what it represents.
Well, there are a lot of ways in which mental health can intersect with the criminal justice system. The one that is most commonly presented to the general public through the media is in cases of what is called in the U.S. an insanity defense, or in Canada, not criminally responsible by reason of mental disorder. And it's based on the legal premise that for most crimes, it's not enough just to have committed the crime, but also the individual must have been able to formulate intent to commit the crime in order to be held responsible for it. And this is where mental health professionals become involved to assess those individuals to reach some sort of determination or opinion about what their mental state was at the time that they committed the offense. People see it as a get-out-of-jail-free card, right? As though the crime never happened, the person gets to leave immediately, they get to go on about their regular lives, and it's simply not true.
So I'm a biomedical engineer, and a biomedical engineer uses engineering principles to solve problems in medicine. But I also work on the show called Deadliest Wear, and my position on the show is lead scientist and biomedical engineer, is to help analyze injury using engineering instruments. And so I've dealt with people like Israeli commandos, Navy SEALs 20, 25 years in, and looking at the techniques that they'll use wielding a blade and things like this. So when I'm speaking here today, that's the expertise that I'm using. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, but I have done a lot of reading in the area of the psychology of killing for combat and in combat endeavors, and how to prevent PTSD in warriors that we send to combat, things of this nature. And I can tell you that from my experience and from my knowledge, whether or not, how he felt about that person, I think there was a part of his brain that realized that this person was a low-risk target. He was a 120-pound boy. He was sleeping. He was right next to him, so it made it easy for him to trap him. He wouldn't see the first strike coming. There's a low likelihood that he was going to be able to fight back after the first strike. And I think all these play, whether or not he's paranoid schizophrenic or not. That's not what I'm here to argue. I'm here to argue that I do believe that there was a part of his brain that knew that this was going to be an easy target. And I don't think there was an accident there. Yeah. And I think there would have been other people within arm's reach. I think those people probably weren't sleeping. They probably weren't 120 pounds, probably were larger males, and perhaps had the essence of being a harder target, so to speak.
It's often noted that Vince Lee was described by eyewitnesses as 6 feet tall and 200 pounds. When his image was released, public opinion was that he appeared smaller. Reporters who were present during the Lee proceedings state that he was in fact close to the height and weight that eyewitnesses conveyed to the media. Within a span of 30 minutes to an hour, Lee did extensive damage to Tim McLean using only a Bowie knife, which he used for the beheading. One theory was that Vince Lee perhaps had some military training, and that he achieved things beyond the scope of a normal person.
So I had the opportunity to read your summary, and there's no question that 20 minutes is more than enough time to get the job done. And in the videos that I've seen, these guys were using blades about that long and curved away from the point of impact, and it took them less than 3 minutes to get the head off. And so 20 minutes with a Bowie knife is more than enough time. We did have a Bowie knife on the show, the Jesse James character, and it went through bone, it went through cartilage, it went through tendinous tissue, it went through basically anything we put it up against. And the blade itself was such that you could get a two-handed grip on it, and you could do horrendous damage with it, there's no question.
So it's not, considering that he had one of these, that's not considered out of the norm for the damage that it did in the amount of time?
No, and I mean, these weapons are available in surplus stores and things of that nature, so they are readily available, and like I say, I think if you want to take somebody down, you can take somebody down with a pen. If you wanted, and like I say, a pocket knife, you could do the job just as easily. The fact that he had a Bowie knife just makes it easier for him.
If it was a coincidence, then you have to ask yourself, well, really, is it a coincidence? You know. But if it's not, then it's still very interesting as a case of the copycat effect. So either way you look at it, it's fascinating and terrifying, terrible thing.
The notion that Vince Lee would have copycatted or been influenced by Nathan's story specifically seems like a reach, honestly. But he doesn't say anything about hunger or cannibalism, right? He doesn't, from anything I've read, he simply believed that he was being persecuted by malevolent forces, Satan and his minions. Tim McLean was another one of those sort of satanic agents that was out to do him harm, and he felt the need to defend himself for fear of his own life. I mean, those are really very typical psychotic symptoms.
Well, hopefully that'll make Nathan feel better.
Yeah.
Get him off his own hook.
But at the same time, the idea that this guy would do these things almost resembling exactly what he
the
talked
fact
about.
that he worked at the paper, you know, that's, whatever the psychiatrist said, well, let's hope he's right.
There's no question this guy was psychotic. Like, again, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but from what I've read about Vince Lee, he was psychotic, and whether or not he consciously knew McLean was a soft target, I think there was a part of his brain that made a decision, this guy's not going to hurt me after I take the first strike. And I think it all leads into the fact of, you know, awareness and self-defense. And when I say self-defense, I don't mean you have to be a black belt in order to defend yourself. And I just mean, you know, awareness. And if a guy in a black shirt and combat pants with a black bag is acting a little weird in a public bus, you might want to sit somewhere else. You might not want to fall asleep by him. No, now saying that, there's only one person that did anything wrong on that bus that night, and that was Vince Lee.
I do hope the family of the victim gets some consolation from this, because I myself did suffer quite a bit. This just played out in my mind over and over again, and psychologically, I couldn't cope with it. And I became physically ill, and everything just about fell apart for me. Despite the fact that everyone telling me, oh, either it's a coincidence or it's not your fault anyway, didn't really do anything to remedy how I did feel. I felt like a murderer. I said, why couldn't he have picked up any other random article in the newspaper about some assault in a parking lot, or why was it this specific thing, you know? And it terrified me, and I felt like I was living in a movie, a horror movie.
To understand the significance of the Wendigo prophecy, we have to understand the social and cultural context. In the late 1800s, a Métis rebellion took place that spread across western Canada, starting in what is now Manitoba. Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont were the heads of the rebellion and successfully united various native nations cross-country. Inspired by news of rebellion, in Alberta, what is called the Trout Lake Massacre took place. In April 1885, various groups banded together and took up arms against white settlers. Shortly after, Louis Riel was captured and executed under the charge of treason, thus ending the rebellion. In the States, in January 1889, a Paiute shaman named Wovoka, known in English as Jack Wilson, had a vision of ancestors returning as ghosts and destroying the white man. In the dream, he was told to do the ghost dance to pay tribute to the dead, and a movement was born. Soon the ghost dance began to spread to other areas and quietly turned into a movement. When word reached the government, they feared that the great chief Sitting Bull would inspire others to join the movement, so they ordered his arrest, which resulted in his death. A few months later, the Wounded Knee massacre occurred for similar reasons. Alberta, 1895. A medicine man prophesies the coming of a Wendigo, stirring fear amongst the population. He warns that their way of life was being threatened by the church, and to save themselves they would have to subscribe to his traditional movement and teachings. Soon after, Napanin arrives in Trout Lake in 1896 and terrifies everyone as they believe he was the Wendigo anticipated in the vision. As a result of the prophecy, people were too scared to gather supplies and food for the winter, resulting in starvation. That same year, the Klondike Gold Rush began, and prospectors from all over began trekking through these territories on their way to the Yukon. As a result, in 1890, Treaty 8 was signed with Native peoples to help define the relationship and responsibilities between the government and the various nations involved. Notice the parallels between Wovoka and the Wendigo prophet. Both saw the indigenous way of life threatened by encroaching values in their territories. Both were preceded by violent revolts against the white man, and both were quickly crushed by the government, causing a great sense of tension between the various groups. Both uttered a prophecy which resulted in dire consequences. The gold rush mirrors what is occurring now in northern Alberta with the tar sands, as this is a contested issue. Issues such as climate change, the economy, and the oil rush bring to mind similar events in the 1800s. Could it be that volatile social conditions are a trigger for those with mental conditions? Nathan Carlson mentioned the prophecy in the newspaper article, which was followed by Vince Lee's actions on the bus, which in effect was a 100-year-old chain reaction to a prophecy. If Vince Lee did read the article, we don't know.
It does seem to be very, I don't know what the phrase is, self-reflective.
Yeah.
It's, you have this declaration, in 1895, and culminates in this event, in this beheading, and mention of Wendigo possession, and talks of a cannibal threat found in a newspaper, discovered by me doing research, and the conclusion of the research ends up being reported in a newspaper, culminating in an event very similar, and then being I become a part of that newspaper coverage.
Yeah.
It's very strange how that works, the whole thing.
Yeah.
I'd say that if anything, whether or not there's a spirit we can objectively call Wendigo or not, I believe more in the fact that stories, events have meaning. And I believe more in the life of this as a story than I do in the life of a monster. I invite anyone who is skeptical about this to read into it, either into my own papers or to the papers, the research of people who've came before me.
Yeah.
This is what I do for a living. I study injury. I'm a black belt. And it's, you hear about these horrendous acts, and not that, I wish I was there. It's just like, please be aware of these things, and please feel the responsibility to empower yourself to go do something about it. And I'm not saying, go buy yourself a 9mm. I'm not saying, train in the various martial arts for the rest of your life. I'm saying just pick up some basic principles that drastically improve your chances of survival.
I haven't heard anything about it, and I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but I haven't heard anything about it that deviates all that greatly from our typical conceptualizations of mental illness. The cannibalism aspect does separate it from most psychotic disorders, but we're not talking about waves of individuals. We're talking about isolated cases here and there, reported very retrospectively, and within that we'd have to tease out the folklore, the parable sort of aspect of it, that this would have been a very real concern in northern and isolated communities, that starvation was going to become an issue, and if it did, then this was going to be the outcome of it. So I think there are a lot of different factors that sort of shape the legend around it, but the behaviors that are being described, including the sort of lead up of withdrawal and being troubled by intrusive thoughts about eating other people, and seemingly in a context of increased stress due to the limited amounts of food and the genuine possibility of starvation. I mean, these all sounds like things that they don't deviate that greatly from our traditional sort of views of schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders.
Here in Portland, you're in the Wendigo capital of the Northwest. There are people beginning to study, not just in anthropology, but in other disciplines as well, history and literary criticism. Study this from many, many angles. I'm just happy that a lot of smart younger people are getting interested in it again. And also I'm very happy that they're beginning to take it seriously as a kind of cultural, historical problem, and not dismiss it simply as kind of a delusion of scholarship or as a scapegoating mechanism by Algonquian people. It's much more complicated and significant than that, and I'm just happy younger scholars are continuing to pay attention to it. So I look to read more and more interesting things in the future.
So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of places where these stories of transforming monsters and so on are take a very different form and a very unique and localized form, and yet you can still see similar sorts of patterns of belief underlying all of them, no matter what the territory is. And I think that's what makes them fascinating, really.
Yeah, we know where we are. We can see where we have to come in and get to you, but we just have to get there. Yeah, we're going under the bridge right now, and we have to tromp through a bit of bush, but we'll be there soon. Letter to his brother. It's a very long letter. He said I can't account for it. He said I can't account for it. Wow, we found it here. Okay. Fort Saskatchewan Jail Cemetery. The original jail cemetery was located south So one of these graves likely represents or likely contains the remains of Swift Runner, the Canada's first serial killer. So unbeknownst to a lot of people, I guess here is the site of a Wendigo. It's a story that came in the guise of something very terrifying. But I think sometimes we need that.
Yeah.
We need to be scared. We need to be frightened. We need to be able to look at our fears in the face and not run from them, because there are things out there we should be afraid of. And most of the time it's caused by things that we ourselves have created. Hopefully this terrifying story will cause us to wake up and make us change our cultural story, our cultural situation.